Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me in the far reaches of Greenspun Hall? No? Well, I will try to talk louder and see if my microphone can pick me up. Thank you all for coming out. I'm Bill Brown with Brookings Mountain West. I have the singular responsibility to welcome you and get out of the way. So I will do that as quickly as possible. Thanks for coming out at the end of the semester, the end of the year, the onset of the rodeo, and a little bit of weather on top of everything else. Welcome. Just want to take a moment of personal privilege. You may have seen this plaque on the left outside. We pass by it every day as proud residents of Greenspun Hall, but we noticed that it's just last week, it was 10 years for the building's anniversary. And we just wanted to acknowledge the Greenspun family and the donors to this building who've given us a great home, as well as, of course, the Greenspun College of Urban Affairs. We've, and in particular, this auditorium is like our second home. We've brought out more than 75 scholars from Brookings who've given more than 100 public lectures here. We, of course, have held many events and symposia like the one you're attending today. So we just wanted to acknowledge that fact. What you see here are a number of reports over the years, going back to 1968, right up through the one report we're going to talk about today, all that have called for some kind of reform in higher education governance. I won't steal the thunder of my speakers. I'll let them give you more details on that. I will just say that in all that time, there hasn't been an independent report that said, keep going. Everything's fine. Keep doing what you're doing. Maybe somewhere out there there's an institute for the perpetuation of the status quo that will issue that kind of report, but we haven't seen it yet. What we have here is just a selection of some reports we've done to address higher education over the years. We looked at this topic in advance of the 15 legislature. We looked at it in advance of the 17 legislature. We're now doing it in advance of the 19 legislature. I want you to know you're all invited to our event where we'll look at it in advance of the 21 legislature. If you want to pull out your phones, just put a save the date for December 11th, 2020. We'll all be here. We'll save the pastries. You don't come next year. That would be nice. Well, you'll get a good seat, but you'll be a year early. So let's get on with the day and talk about let our colleagues talk about this event. There'll be, of course, the mandatory PowerPoint presentations. They'll be up on our website for this event, so you'll be able to refer to any of the data or information there. Your supervisors who you report back to will be able to refer to it. You'll be able to send any policymakers or individuals interested in this topic. And of course, with our help from our friends at Greenspun College, the video of our event today will be up on the website in a week or so. So I urge you to enjoy the morning, challenge our speakers. We don't do a lot of long introductions here because we print them in our programs. So let me just bring up David Demore, the chair of the UNLV Political Science Department, to get us started.
Thank you, Bill. All right, thanks everybody for coming out this morning. So what I want to talk a little bit about here is sort of how we got where we are, and I want to reverse engineer this. So we're going to sort of talk about outcomes, and then we're going to go down the rabbit hole and figure out how this all began, so we can understand how we might be able to think about fixing it in the 2019 session here. So I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on outcomes here, because anybody who reads the news in Nevada knows how dysfunctional higher ed can be. But just to give you some context here and why it's been an ongoing target. In addition to the study, I want to point out, in addition to the studies that Bill noted there's been lots and lots of bills over the years trying to address this in various ways there, and we'll take a look at what happened in 2017 in a little detail here. Well, the first here is just in terms of outcomes, right? Nevada's 45th out of the 50 states in terms of share of population over 25 with a college degree. It's about 22–23% there. If you look at our graduation rates at all the institutions, they're well below the national average here. National average for universities is about 6-year graduation rates, about 60%. UNLV and UNR are below that, as well as the community colleges and the 4-year colleges. In terms of research output here, right, neither UNLV nor UNR has obtained the highest Carnegie classification. This is the more colloquially known as Tier 1 for those in academics. We refer to it as R1, Research 1 here. And what's this all about here? So I think Jim's here. Jim, you here? Yes, he is, right? So back in Neil Samatras's presidency, we began this process here. And Jim used to be the president of the RAND Corporation. He created the framework to understand progression towards this goal here. So this got trotted out in 2010. I think Don Snyder's here. Don, I think you were the president at the time when this sort of came about. Well, as you'll see here, what's happened in the short period of time is UNLV has made quite a bit of progress actually on the research front. Here in the 5-year estimate here. Now again, this is before the medical school goes in, right? So the anticipation here is the medical school will sort of push us above that here. I think a reasonable target is UT Dallas, and then hopefully maybe down in a decade or so, Central Florida there. So we are sort of making progress on this, and the main drivers of this, of course, are research expenditures as well as PhDs that are granted at an institution here. So, unlike K through 12, this isn't about funding, right? We often think about, well, K through 12, you don't put a lot of money in it, you're not going to get great outcomes. We're actually well above right around the national median. We rank about 20th in per student funding. So it's not an issue of funding here. It's really an issue in our belief of structure. If you look at our structure here, the states we share this with, most similar are Alaska, Hawaii, and North Dakota. Those states have the combined population of Nevada. So that's what we're working with here, right? So it's a single governing board that oversees all of the public higher education institutions, and also a single agency, and as we'll see here in a minute, you also use a single funding formula to fund the operational budgets for these schools. Now, does anybody think it makes a whole lot of sense to have the same board that oversees certifications for vocational training as well as medical schools? No? No? Okay. All right. Well, if you are, you're in the right state for that. But you'll find we're a little bit outlier there. So just to put this in perspective, the size of our administration here, if you look and break down the various budget items and what goes to system administration exceeds the amount of money the state appropriates to these institutions. So again, you're putting more money in system administration than you're putting into those schools that are supposed to deliver higher education. That seems a little out of whack, right? So, go back to the 2017 section. Great UNLV alumni, Elliot Anderson, also went to Boyd as well. He brought a couple of the bills we're going to talk about here, and this is his sort of take on it. Right? If the system's different and it's successful, then it's a model. If it's different and failing, then let's change it. It's time Nevada changes the way higher education is organized. And this is part of his testimony before, I believe, the Assembly or Senate Legend Ops Committee talking about AJR 5. So why hasn't this happened? Well, there's lots and lots of barriers to essentially reform here. The first one here, as a political scientist, what we spend a lot of time doing is thinking about how the rules of the game shape behavior and they shape outcome. When I talk to policymakers about institutions, they largely see institutions, that is, the rules of the game, as fixed. And if you talk about, well, what about changing them here? What often comes out is uncertainty. We're uncertain of what the outcome would be here. In addition, carrying any reform initiatives is a heavy lift, and the benefits are unclear. So for a legislator or a policymaker thinking about the opportunity costs, he might take a pass on this. In addition, you have essentially the protectors of the status quo. That is, the folks who are most invested in perpetuating the status quo are those who have the direct access to the levers of power here. And if we think about, in this case, NCHE has full-time lobbyists, although not so many anymore, since they lost a couple of them over the last couple of weeks there. But what we're able to hear is during the coming session, they've actually hired lobbyists from private lobbyists to help with their agenda there. Most government and many government structures are contained in constitutions, and changing constitutions is very, very difficult. In Nevada, for example, if it comes through the legislative process, it has to pass 2 consecutive sessions and then go to the vote of the people. That is a 5-year process here. And as we're going to see, there's also a great deal of uncertainty and misconception about the Board of Regents' constitutional carve-out. There's simply in this state a mismatch between what the legislature can do and what the policy demands of the state are. We have a very small, the 4th smallest legislature in terms of number of members. We're also one of 4 states that meets every 2 years. Right? They're a citizen legislature, so they're poorly compensated for their time and their effort here. And when we think about what reforms have been made in the legislative process, they've actually been weakened quite a bit, in particular term limits, and more importantly, a 120-day calendar session. Not session days, calendar session. Essentially 4 months to do the state's business. But it's also important to remember that Nevada is not a home rule state. So in addition to doing state business, they're doing all the local government business in 120 days. The end result is you want to move big policy, you've got to have buy-in from the governor, right? It requires gubernatorial muscle. So where we have seen some movement, most notably on economic development and reforming that structure, that was from the governor, right? So that's where we need here. You got to have gubernatorial buy-in here to move this through the process here. So with that all said, let's take a look at sort of what has been presented to us as reform in the past here. So if we go back a few years, there was an effort to reform the funding formula. You might recall this here. I actually did a pretty detailed brief. It's at this point kind of mind-numbing, but if you want to know the minutiae of how everything, the mechanics work, I suggest you read this or at least take a skim, and I think there's some copies outside there. And so what we do here, so where'd this come from? Well, obviously this has been a long-standing grievance in the North-South fight in the state here, right? The notion that there's inequity in the funding that favors northern institutions, particularly UNR, right? And this sort of comes to a head. The original version of this bill, interestingly, was actually a bill to move Clark County property taxes to fund CSN. As it turns out, you can't do that. So what it comes is a study session, a study bill, and then it turns into essentially a rebooting of the entire formula here. So if we look at the outcomes of the formula, we can clearly see the political goals that were trying to be achieved here. The first was some sense of equity and transparency here. So the formula develops a metric, which is called the weighted student credit hour, that allocates the funding for all of the teaching institutions here. It's the same metric used for everybody, equitable. Movement of money from north to south, but not from all the northern campuses, as we will see. It's from the smallest campuses that actually take the biggest hits under the new structure here. UNR is saved. It also decouples the funding that students bring to campus from the state funding. Under the old arrangement, the more money you had brought in through student fees counted against your state share. So on the fast-growing southern campuses, right, as the student population is growing, the students are essentially paying much bigger share of the funding for their education than what you would find in the slower growing parts of the state there. So that's now been decoupled there. So these are sort of the political goals that got accomplished here. But as a piece of public policy, it's a little dubious. So imagine doing a study on higher education funding, hiring 2 consultants, and then not bothering to do a cost analysis of what actually it costs to deliver higher education. That's what happened here. No cost analysis. In fact, the cost basis for the funding formula comes from 4 other states that have a structure and a population that look nothing like Nevada's. They essentially borrowed them, averaged them, and that provided the basis for the matrix. The matrix is what determines how much weight each class gets in the funding formula here. And the matrix essentially tilts heavily towards the universities. In fact, it was designed essentially for universities here. This means that community colleges do not do well under the funding formula as currently structured here. It's also important to remember that there are formula budgets and non-formula budgets. And these are fairly fluid in some instances here. In particular, you may have heard about statewide programs budget, right? This is a Bill Raggio creation as a way to move money directly to UNLV and UNR here. And so what you find is there's a lot of fluidity, that things that might have been funded before in the funding formula simply get moved to the statewide programs budget. So in the case of the statewide current biennium, UNLV gets about $3 million in statewide programs funding, UNR gets about $8 million.
David, who was driving this, this whole process here?
At the time, it's hard not to say it's not all Bill Raggio. He had been there the longest time. You look over this, and we'll see this here in a minute, is sort of how we try to tie it all together on that one there. Yeah. And what you find here is that once these sort of budget structures get created, they never go away. They become part of the structure, and it just sort of moves through the process once they've been created here. The other part of the formula here is because it tries to treat every institution the same, but also realize that every institution has a different constituency, different needs in the state there. It also creates a bunch of institutional carve-outs for example, research missions to help adjust for the scale issues in some of the smaller community colleges, most notably Western Nevada and Great Basin College here. But again, there's no cost basis for this. This is just sort of numbers that come out of thin air. There's also no upfront money to support first generation or students who come from lower socioeconomic status. In fact, if you look at how the mechanics of the formula work, it actually takes about 20% off of every school's allocations as a performance holdback. And if you meet certain metrics, including graduating Pell Grant students, graduating minority students, you will get that money back 2 years down the road. So there's no, yes, I know you're looking at me like, yeah, that's how it works. That was seen as a major reform. So, subsequent to doing this analysis and sort of thinking this is all kind of weird, we found out that, hey, the creation of the formula was pretty corrupt. So you may remember Bethany Barnes, right? She did a number of some investigative reporting, and she found out a couple of things, and I just want to highlight a couple of these points here. Right, the first and probably the most damning was that as this discussion's coming to the end, lots of questions about where these numbers came from, what they mean, how they're going to translate into policy. And NCHEMS, the NCHE's consultant in this process, essentially let NCHE use its letterhead to write its response. This goes through the legislative process. No one knows about this for years and years. In addition, we also now know that prior to the committee even meeting to select their consultants, NCHE and its consultant were already working on the formula and actually had briefed the regents who sat on the committee before the fact. So one of the, just to give you a sense of this is one of the emails that Bethany Barnes uncovered through a Freedom of Information Act. And this is an exchange between Crystal Abba, Vice Chancellor of NCHE, Dennis Jones, who is the consultant from NCHEMS, also CC'd on this email is Chancellor Dan Claich, and former Chancellor Jan Nichols. So Dennis, you're the best. Thanks for the quick response. All good suggestions that we will incorporate. We met with some of the regents who are on the formula committee this morning. It could not have gone better. They ate it up. Miracles never ceased. Thanks again, Crystal. Jones then replies, obviously you did a great job of making the Chancellor sound like he knows what he's selling. A form of miracle in its own way. Nichols then replied, Dan, you own this now and sold it amazingly. Dennis, if none of this would have happened except for your coming and helping us buy into this concept. So again, this is before the committee even meets to select their consultant. So, what does a corrupt formula generate? So what this table here is on the left is the sort of pre-formula share of the NCHE budget that's dedicated to instructional, providing instructional, the instructional budgets. All right. And so this is about 80% of the total allocation. So this isn't the med school, this isn't the law school, this isn't the dental school, the professional schools, as well as some of the other budget lines like athletics in there. And then on the right column is where it is after the formula gets implemented here. So John, he got LCB to sort of run a quick analysis of sort of what this means. And so what I do in this table is I essentially plug in the difference between these two shares using current biennium's budget allocations. And clearly what you see is from the old to the new, every school takes a hit in their budgeting, except for one. So what does this look like here? So if we go and we sort of take the big picture and we look at all the funds that go to UNR and all the funding that goes into UNLV, on the left is before the funding formula, on the right is after the funding formula. And you'll see there's not a whole lot of difference there. In fact, UNLV is about $1,700 less per student, per full-time student, than UNR here. Now, as an aside, these data actually used to be on the NG website. I took a couple of screenshots once I saw these and said, these aren't going to be there very long. And sure enough, the Las Vegas Sun got a hold of these and they said, what's going on here? I thought the funding formula was supposed to make things equitable. Called the system office. The chancellor said, oh, it's F grade, something about, kind of stumbled through a response that was not inaccurate, was totally inaccurate there. After that, a couple of things happen here. These data go away. You can't find them on the website anymore there. What was interesting, though, is the fact that the chancellor didn't know how the funding actually operated. He had enough sort of certainty to push out a popular president, but didn't really know how the funding actually worked. If we go to the 2- and 4-year colleges here, right, pre-formula on the left, post-formula on the right here, you see it begins to sort of equalize over time here, because again, all these schools don't have the other funding. They don't have the professional schools, they don't have the statewide programs and all those kinds of things there. So you do see some sort of regional equity there, but as John's going to talk about here, does this give these schools enough money to actually do what they're supposed to do? So that's what passes for reform in Nevada. So in the 2017 session, there were lots and lots of bills. After Dan Klage's early retirement from NC, a lot of anger in the legislature, and you saw lots and lots of bills there. Comes from both chambers, all parts of the state, all parts of the both parties on that, right? So we tracked a lot of these bills in the 2017 session. We wrote a report on this, and what we end up finding here is that one exception, it's the only bill that actually didn't have to go to the governor, was failed or were vetoed. Bills that provide the system more funding were all approved. So this is a report. I believe there's copies out there on this. It's pretty detailed and it gives you a good sense of how the mechanics of the legislature operate here. But these are the bills we tracked here. We're going to talk about AGR 5 in a minute and AB 407 in a minute here. But as you can see, there's a couple of other ones that are of great significance. AB 331 sought to separate the 2- and 4-year colleges from the branch of the state university there. You also have the appropriation for the medical school building that came in at the end of the session there. I also want to note, what is it, AB 188. Right, this is a bill that would have increased accessibility to what is called the Silver State Opportunity Grants Program and lowered the threshold. That bill was vetoed. AB 407 was also vetoed. Both of those bills, interestingly enough, were carried by Olivia Diaz, and as you may have heard, she just left the legislature to run for the city council. I wonder why. So let's take a look at AB, and if you want the Reader's Digest version, we got an op-ed on this. So I want to put this up here. I'm not going to be able to read it all, but this actually comes from the preamble to AGR 5, the bill that proposes to remove the regents from the Constitution here. And just give this a read to get a sense of the sort of the anger of the legislature at what's going on here. I'm not quite sure if I've ever seen a more scathing indictment of an institution or an administrative structure than that in an actual piece of legislation here. So what does this bill do? So what I'm going to do here is sort of show you what it looks like from the perspective of the legislature. So this, if this passes again in 2019, this will be on your ballot in 2020. Okay? And so what this addresses is Section 4 of the, Section 4 of Article 2 of the Nevada Constitution. And this is important because this does two things. It establishes the state's land grant, and it also establishes the authority of the Board of Regents to oversee the land grant institution. Okay, as you can see, what this bill would do would remove the regents' control over the land grant and essentially put it in the hands of the legislature. They would be able to determine how this operates here. AB 407, right, is an important bill. This is the bill that sought to essentially clarify what the land grant institution is in Nevada. Now, if you go to the legislature, one of the things you'll quickly learn is that people are wary of short bills. This is the entirety of the bill. Now, who could be opposed to this? As it turned out, it passed both chambers with a supermajority, a bipartisan supermajority. In the Senate, however, it was a purely regional vote. It goes to the governor. The governor, however, vetoes it. And as it turns out, he apparently vetoed the wrong version of the bill. The original version of the bill had sought to reorganize cooperative extension based upon some research that we had conducted. And what we found in that research is cooperative extension run out of UNR is sitting on $13 million of unspent property tax in Clark County. Just sitting there for years and years and years, providing no service and no programming. That got removed from the bill to just simply establish the land grant and to request an audit of cooperative extension. This bill could be, the veto could be overridden of this, as Rob will talk about at the start of the next legislative session here. Okay. So now you have sort of a sense of how reform looks, but to really understand what we're talking about, we got to go down the rabbit hole. And I'm going to tell you where we end up. It's not pretty, but you need to understand these issues. Okay. So what happens here is UNR is created, long-standing institution. Then you have the Southern Nevada Division gets created in 1957. You get DRI a little bit later than that. And so now you have this semblance of a system, if you will. Right? And so what happens in 1969, of January of 1969, the regents vote to change the name of Nevada Southern University to the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Right? This, of course, raises a question here. And Mr. Humphrey, in this case, is Neil Humphrey, who is the first chancellor of the system. Now, what's also interesting here is that in 1969, right, prior to this sort of creation of a system, Mr. Humphrey's title was president, and the chancellors were in charge of the individual institutions. Right? That's a structure similar to what you see in the UCs. It's the UC president and the chancellors of each campus here. In reality, the president, or in this case the chancellor, is really an executive director. It's been elevated to president, and then they elevate it again to chancellor, which is an academic title, not an administrative title here. So what comes back from the Attorney General's office is essentially there's one land grant with 3 branches to it: UNR, UNLV, DRI, and they're not going to hold separate land grants. However, when we get to the 1969 session, when they have to begin to put this in statute here, what you will clearly see here is that the seat of the state university as described in the Constitution, that is the land grant, overseen by the Board of Regents, is actually located on the UNR campus. UNR is the solitary land grant institution here. And you can see UNLV is clearly below that. You also now see the change to the corporate name to reflect that it is now a system, not a single university here. 1981, we see another change. Change here now essentially puts the land grant and establishes it not with one of the campuses, but in the office of the chancellor of the system, the University of Nevada system here. And now you see below that are UNR and UNLV. This is essentially the structure that AB 407 is trying to recreate. And you may scratch your head and say, why would we need to recreate that? Well, things get weird. So fast forward to 1993 here. Now, the establishment of the land grant is with the Chancellor's office, but now it's no longer the University of Nevada system. Now it's the University and Community College System of Nevada. You have now put every school, including the community colleges, including the administrative structure, into the land grant. There's also a subsequent change to the corporate name, but it was actually now so big you can't even fit on the slide. 2005, it changes again, and this is where the name changes to what we now call the Nevada System of Higher Education. So you may be wondering if it makes a whole lot of sense to put community colleges and administrative structures into the land grant. As it turns out, there's no other state that really does it this way. This creates lots and lots of uncertainty, however, particularly for UNLV, as it is part of the land grant, but in order to access the material resources of the land grant, and these can be, for example, the ability to oversee cooperative extension, but more importantly, it provides you access to federal grants reserved for land grants, and it also reduces the federal overhead associated with certain land grants. Pretty much a win for the state here. So, if you go into the AB 407 exhibits that were offered in that testimony there in the debate over that bill, you'll actually find there's a letter from the USDA who oversees land grant at the federal level, and they're like, what is this? We get how UNLV's part of the land grant, but how can you have community colleges and how can you have a system administrative office as part of the land grant? That just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So, as the system grows, right, it brings in the community colleges, states growing, more students, right, and we have a part-time board who's compensated, I think, $90 a meeting. 80. Oh, 80. $80 a meeting here, right? Obviously, they don't have the capacity to manage this here. So what happens over time is you start giving more and more authority over to the bureaucratic part of the bureaucracy, essentially. So there's sort of roadmaps. In 2004, for example, there was a vote essentially allowing the NC Chancellor to make hires within the system structure without having to get approval from the BOR. 1 year later, we have an interim chancellor by the name of Jim Rogers. Some of you may have heard of him. And he makes a proposal, and he essentially says, if you want me to be the chancellor of the system, I will do it for $1. But I also want more consolidation of the power of the chancellor. In particular, I want the ability to fire presidents. Now this is coming from the business world. I'm the chief executive officer, branch manager number 2 is not performing, out you go. That's the mindset here, right? So this is hotly debated on the regents, right? Goes back and forth, extended debate there. The vote finally gets called. The vote for this is 12 regents in favor, 1 opposed. The one regent who votes against this is Steve Sisolak. He soon leaves the board, then moves to the county commissioner, and I think, oh, that's right, he's our new governor. There. So this is someone very, very familiar with the structure of the system as well as to its consolidation here. Okay, so what does this mean in practicality? So this is an example of what the org structure would work here. The regents oversee all the presidents. They're reporting directly to the presidents there, as is the chancellor overseeing the system office, reporting directly to the regents. Post-vote, you might think of it more like this, right? That essentially now the direct reporting is not to the Board of Regents, it's to the chancellor, right? This is stunning, right? One of the concerns we have as someone who studies government is fear of unaccountable bureaucrats and staff essentially usurping the power of the elected officials. Here you have an example of elected officials voting away their power to an unelected bureaucrat. It's quite stunning here. Now, what are the consequences of this? How has this worked out here? Well, since this went into effect, UNLV's gone through 4 full-time presidents. We're now on our 2nd acting president here. This also corresponds with the period of time in which UNLV made a push to get in the Carney classification, to rise in those ranks, as well as to position itself to have its own medical school here. Now, no one's been directly fired. Right? In fact, if you want to go back to last time some president was fired, you have to go back to Ron Remington, back in the early part of the decade here. And if you read the media coverage of this, it's unbelievable what happened here, as it should be when you want to fire a president here. Ron Remington, of course, sues the regents over open meeting law violations and ends up getting his job back there. Right? And the presumption here was that this was going to essentially lead to reform. It did not lead to reform here. But what it does is it allows soft power to be used essentially to allow the chancellor to establish priorities for the campus and then to impose a gag rule not allowing presidents to talk on their own to essentially what their priorities are or where they might disagree with the system's priorities here. So how has this worked out for us? How has Jim Rogers' $1 deal worked out for us here? Well, the person who inherited that job after him clearly corrupted it. The person who now holds the job, before he took the job, we had a well-regarded president both in the community and the campus. We had about $70 million in funding for the medical school building. Now we have a lot of uncertainty about who our president's going to be, and we have no money for the medical school building. I told you when you got to the bottom of the rabbit hole it wasn't going to be pretty. So we got Rob here, who's going to tell us how we might get out of this. One last word on this. This isn't all of it. I would have blown up PowerPoint had I put it all in there.
Kind of a tough act to follow. Okay, so here's my humble talk. I don't have as much detail as my colleague Dave Damore, and what I'm going to cover is mostly what kind of reform you could see in this legislative session, based on the fact that you can do most reforms we're looking to do without the legislative change in the status and the constitutional shift in the status of the regents, that most things are under Nevada revised statute. So that's a fortunate thing for us, because we can get moving. So who am I? Just first, I know it's the bio's in there. I'm a college professor. Before I was here, I was at Virginia Tech. That becomes relevant in a moment, as you'll see. And then a disclaimer. So whenever I do these talks, I just want it understood. I'm not an agent of the university. I'm an agent of Rob. I'm me. I'm a college professor. Yay. Okay? And college professors, you know, whenever like an autocratic regime takes over, the college professors disappear instantly. You remember the book Sophie's Choice? Sophie's dad was a college professor who was pro-Nazi, but they didn't bother to even check that out. The Nazis just killed him because he was a college professor, because that's what you do. So college professors are always saying crazy things. In fact, the better the school, the crazier the stuff, the more controversial, the more they speak truth to power. So it's a good sign to have people like me and Dave, and notice that whenever we do these talks, it's always the full professors who are tenured that end up giving these talks, because we recognize that some of our colleagues could be at risk in this structure, and we're not, because it's hard to sort of displace a tenured faculty member if they're doing their job, and part of their job is to actually do research on governance. And if they're just calmly laying out a case for reform, what's the harm? You could just ignore it. I mean, I was in a state before here, Virginia, everything like there that the university did was a big yawn, and whenever I went and spoke about transportation policy, they were like, that's really nice. That's good theory. Meanwhile, this is what we're doing. And I never took it personally. It was just a, nobody was hot and heated over it. It was just a matter of course that, certain agents had to be responsible for the state's budget in these categories. You could give input. They appreciated it. If the input was well taken, they would move forward with it. By the way, you notice I got Satan up there, and then Kingsfield from the paper chase. He yelled at a lot of people too, that guy. So I begin with a brief legal and historic context, slightly different than Dave's. And these are sort of best of scenes out of the NG meetings. And then I move on to proposing bills and legislative changes for higher ed. Now I want to start though back in old Virginia. So recently, you know, Amazon, after torturing the whole country and promising everybody, you know, that they were going to get an Amazon branch, and everybody going down. Now, Amazon's, by the way, got the most complete information in the United States about how to do economic development, which is genius, you know where every incentive is and all that. They end up picking two locations. One is New York City, and for it, they get a fortune out of New York City. They get a heliport, even, you know. I love that. I want to get one of those. I'm going to get an incentive where I get a heliport. I don't have a helicopter. I just think it'd be neat to have a heliport. Play handball on it. And then they also go to Northern Virginia. They don't pick Maryland. They don't pick the District of Columbia. They pick Northern Virginia. And if you look at the Forbes article on it, it says that Virginia Tech, my old institution and my old campus, I was at Virginia Tech. I was department chair in urban planning, and I was running a center called the Metropolitan Institute. They were in Alexandria, Virginia, just south of Arlington, and I was the original hire in planning on that campus. So part of the incentive that I got from Virginia Tech was always looking at how many more assets we could move into the biggest region in the state and the wealthiest region, which is Northern Virginia, and away from Blacksburg, Virginia, which is 300 miles into Appalachia, and we called it Bleaksburg, especially in winter. So Amazon says, yeah, we want Virginia Tech as a partner. The state and Virginia Tech's foundation come through with the proposal for $1 billion campus. $1 billion campus, which is what they're going to build. The reason I raise this is the Forbes piece also has another little wiggle to it, which is before Amazon contacted Virginia Tech proper, before it touched the university, it actually reached to the State Office of Higher Education, which is the State Council for Higher Education for Virginia, SHEV. And they went to SHEV and they said, we'd like university partnerships. And here's what SHEV did. Let us get out of the way. I think you want Virginia Tech. And SHEV was never heard from again, because Virginia Tech was the institution that was relevant because it had the engineering faculty, it had the computer science faculty, it had all the technical expertise. It's the land-grant university of Virginia, of which we're in a land grant, as you see now, in Nevada. I've always been at land grants, went to Rutgers, which is a land grant. Virginia Tech was charged with things like the industrial connectivity under the Land Grant Act. It was ag and mechanical, and the mechanical part includes things in the modern day like Amazon and software and technology. And Virginia Tech was the relevant institution, and the important lesson here is the first thing that organization did at the State Higher Ed Office, which, by the way, has 42 schools and is only like 65, 70 people. And get this, check this out. They're actually located in the state capitol, it turns out. Because how many people that work in higher ed in the state of Nevada are located in the state capitol? Zero. 0.0, like Blutarsky's GPA, since we're in a college. 0.0. That is weird that you have that. You know, I mean, there are system offices sometimes at the University of Colorado that's based out of Boulder, but when the whole state higher ed office is folded in, it's always out of Denver. It's not out of Chapel Hill. It's out of Raleigh. You know, it's out of Sacramento, even though Oakland is where the UC structures run. If there was just something called the University of Nevada and you wanted to have it on our campuses, you could do that. But when you have the whole system office, you need to put that in the state capitol. You know that's why they build state capitals. They want everybody connected. It's all efficient that way. And that's where you do your job. So in the Tesla deal, what's interesting is Tesla came because we created an incentive structure, and they had a great location in northern Nevada, and they had, you know, lower land costs, lower regulation, lower taxation, you know, labor force and so on. That made sense, and it was near where their supply chain came through. That's what Reno's competitive advantage is, proximity to San Francisco. So all of that factored in. They were like, oh, and you have universities? We didn't even know that. Do you really? And also, forget just, you know, Amazon and how abstract that is way over in Virginia and the East Coast and Old Dominion, as they refer to it. I was involved at various phases, and by the way, the Brookings Institution, Brookings Mountain West, and SRI International, the vendor that was supposed to do our formula study, did the State Economic Development Plan, which laid a lot of the platform out, the governance structure I wrote in particular for that document. And we have a big development. The equivalent of the Tahoe Reno Industrial Center in the north is Apex in North Las Vegas, and they were starting to get a lot of feelers for doing industrial firms there. And one of the first questions the firms asked, and there were several firms looking, was, well, who's our workforce? Now, here's the great thing about Las Vegas. Las Vegas has never been charged with anything that it failed to deliver sufficient workforce to produce. In other words, think of the scale of the buildings in the Strip. And think of the complexity of City Center. Think of the complexity of the physical plant of Las Vegas. We have never had a labor shortage that prevented the completion of, in a timely manner, and we'll complete the stadium in a timely manner, of those assets. And the reason is that we have been successful at inducing labor migration from other markets. So many people in this room were not born in this valley. The majority, I suspect, of people in this room were not born in this valley. Many of them come from Los Angeles, some of them come from places like Phoenix and the rest of the Mountain West. So I developed a little method of saying, using the Brookings data, the Brookings Institution keeps data on tech workers, how many places are proximate to us and how likely is it that we could reach into those labor pools, and what are those labor pools comprised of? And fortunately for us, the labor pool in Los Angeles is so large, so diverse, and so sick of high housing costs, and so close in Las Vegas that you don't lose family, that the back and forth is a sort of expectation. There's such a habit of selling the house in Orange County or LA County and moving to Las Vegas, that it's not a shock to move to Las Vegas. So I came up with a method that said, I think we can look into these labor markets. And the reason I raised this is, and I was in Hawaii when I had to connect some of these dots, is that originally North Las Vegas went to NSHE. And NSHE only said, we just have a closed universe of our institutions, and here's what we have by way of labor pool. And the companies went, oh, that's a real problem. And we're about to back out, as a matter of fact. So I went in and I fixed this, and here's me. We did an Urban Land Institute study, advisory services panel to make it complete. There's me with the Mayor Lee of North Las Vegas. You can ask him about this story. And what was weird about it is, again, you didn't go to the state universities. The state universities always have faculty, especially in land-grant universities, where the faculty are not just theoretical. I was the other day at the Claremont universities. I gave a talk, and I met the faculty there, and they're expert in Kathmandu's governance structure. I'm expert in Las Vegas. That's what you have at state universities. That somebody who, in the mundane topic of our little world, Dave's knowledge of state legislatures, in particular this one, my knowledge of economic development is relevant to Sunbelt cities and to the West. We're the kind of faculty you might want to bring in the process, but we were not brought in the process. When in 2016 I talked about this, one of the agents of NSHE was in the room, and I actually left for a moment and wasn't there when this happened, but I'd been told. He said, the chancellor would hit the ceiling if he knew you were talking about bringing in people from other states. What? Who knows? The chancellor lost his job 4 weeks later anyway, so whatever ceiling he was going to hit. But it was bizarre. I'm like, that's not a, no, everybody wants to say, not only can we provide you with the resources within the state, and not only will we ramp up the performance of those resources, especially as you stimulate demand for it because you're coming in with your corporation, we also have access to these additional labor pools. What would Las Vegas be without these labor pools? Do you realize we did this thing on the middle class in this very room? People were shocked at how big our middle class was. Yeah, we borrowed it from California. They sold their houses there, they had equity there, they had retirement savings there. You know, we live on these borrows. These are great. This is a virtuous place to be. And we could borrow anybody's labor pool. Anybody move to Vegas. And that's what we should tell every firm. Anybody that wants to come here and we want to deliver an asset and they need industrial workers associated with it, we'll get them. And they're not going to be across the country. They're going to be in LA or Phoenix. All right, and then, so what's the lesson? Businesses do not want uninformed bureaucrats between them and the expert faculty at land-grant universities. And if you put them in the way, they're going to go elsewhere. And as a personal aside, I love to tell these little vignettes. So I was watching a Board of Regents meeting. Why? I don't know. I like to torture myself. And I'm watching it, and they're talking about the logo. They debated this for like 45 minutes. One of the regents finally, Rick Trachok, said, we have been debating this for 45, what are we doing? They're debating the logo and which one to pick. They had a contest. And I'm looking at the logo and I think, I've seen this before, somehow. And I went on the internet and the lower thing is, that's just a generic logo with a little code at the bottom that if you wanted to pay for it, you would take this logo and pay a royalty. I mean, the reason I'm raising this is, did anyone just do due diligence on this thing? I mean, you debated it for 45 minutes. The place that can't do due diligence on something as simple as a logo and a logo contest, I'm guessing is probably not going to be great managing Amazon. Just throwing it out there. Just think it might correlate. All right, so a couple of quick terms and I'll go into the reforms. So there is an NSHE system office and a chancellor for the administration of the system. There's a Board of Regents of the University of Nevada for governance. There is no such thing as an NSHE Board of Regents, even though you see that appear popularly in the press. It's not a trivial or technical point. It actually concerns whether or not we can make the changes we want to make. Because when you say NSHE Board of Regents, you're implying that NSHE itself is part of the constitutional carve-out. But it's not. It's just a system office. Everywhere else, this is just something that you put in Richmond or Trenton or someplace like that, or you put it in Santa Fe, you put it in a state capital, and it's at 60 people. It's run by somebody who's an executive director, and they tend to have a master's in business administration or public administration, and they're experts in intergovernmental relations, and they do things like compliance to make sure that you're abiding by federal standards, and blah, 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 and you could put the kids to sleep on what they do. All right, they're not supposed to be stepping in front of presidents, getting out there and saying, I want to talk about how we're the most diverse national university and we're not even doing a good job at it, or whatever the last regent's the last chancellor's comments were on that. And the other thing is that you actually vote, and this is interesting. I love the regents that I want to change the community colleges. You do know that you ran for an office that says Regent State University. These are state university regents. Now, in other states, like going back to old Virginia, they had a Board of Visitors. If you ever told those Board of Visitors that, hey, in addition to looking at Virginia Tech and worrying about its engineering programs and Amazon and its football team, could you also provide counsel on Northern Virginia's community college in Fairfax County? They'd say, no, 2 reasons. 1, that's not my charge, and 2, there's no sports there and I don't get any free tickets to the game, so I'm not going to do it. Okay. It's not. I used to go to Board of Regents meetings or the equivalent where, get this, the topic was Virginia Tech. Then they had the University of Virginia one, and so on. We don't have to be separate from UNR. We're in a common system. But there's no reason in the world why there has to be a discussion in the community colleges. I love the community colleges. Brookings has a long track record of promoting the idea that community colleges have tons of positive role to play in economic development. This governor wants to work on community colleges. But the community colleges need boards that are comprised out of locals who are part of the industrial mix in the city, and maybe some leading people in the state, and they should be appointed. And they should be appointed by governors and local officials and so on. So I think that we have the Legislative Council Bureau on our side. I think the real reform begins now. So what do we do? Step 1. Well, Dave noted, repass H.R. 5. By the way, I have the sad little veto bill over there. Remember Schoolhouse Rock? That's Bill. Bill would be sad in the Nevada State Legislature if it concerned education, because he's getting burned. So revote AB 407. It was easy. It was a supermajority. I think we'll get it through. And then just a quick thing that the legislature can do. A lot of states have switched to this. I think it's something like, Magda knows the number, something like 29 or 30 states have switched. They smartly combine higher ed and economic development together instead of just education. Then education can focus on K through 12. Okay, so the education committee separately can focus, and we need a lot of focus on K through 12. But we also need focus on higher ed, especially as it pertains to economic development. You could do this in the majority party by just creating the committee structure. So we're suggesting that. So that could be done the first day of the legislature. And then what we're going to propose as our first bill is, we call it the One System Office Bill. So for a long time, people are like, you know what they want to do? Those crazy people at UNLV, they want to break up NSHE. No, we don't. We never wanted to break up NSHE. There's only one system office in other states. You don't need multiple system offices for the main system office for the state. What we wanted to do was actually create a state system office, maybe instead of even putting system in there because it implies too much grandiosity, call it the Nevada Office of Higher Education, or NOE. And here's what you might want to do. How about you move it to Carson City, where it belongs? Because that's where the government is. And there's a lot of high-paying jobs. I'm sure the mayor of Carson City would love to get NSHE. It's like lifestyles that are rich and famous. I mean, before a certain fellow died who tracked the lifestyles that are rich and famous, one of the things I think he was speculating on was whether or not to follow NSHE around, because they are well paid. They're paid above the median for the faculty. They're paid above the median for all our staff. They are the plumbest place to be. In fact, they've even told people, I've had students say to me, they tell me never leave the system office. It's the sweet, sweet spot for high pay. So I don't think we need that kind of bloat and bureaucracy. The NOE office should be under the presidents and regents, as it is in other places, or at par at the least. And by the way, they should go back to executive director, as they were. And then the staff, 240 to 70. Why am I saying that? So if you're in my little bureaucracy, you notice what NG does. It recovers all the work the universities do. So we do these budget calculations, and then they go over all of that, not for compliance sake. So of course a system office like that is responsible for an audit, selecting out and culling out places where they suspect that there's been impropriety, and then identifying it and alerting, proper people about that mistake. Here, it's almost a complete new level of state university governance. I mean, in state university administration, I should say, pardon me. It's like an extra layer. Everything we do, they do. Everything we do, they second guess. Everything we want to do, we want to have this system or that, they do. They do. And that's why they've grown and grown and grown and grown. That's why there's 240 people approximately for, 7 schools. And you got 70 people in Virginia for 42 schools. The reason is the system office is appropriate. It's there in Richmond doing dorky business. Allocate the savings from NOE to the cuts in it to the schools. Hey, by the way, it's a lot. Did you see when Dave put that up there? That it's more than the law school. It's more than the med school. It's more than Great Basin. It's more than Western Nevada. It's more than DRI. It's more than schools that, we've been starving the schools and building the office that's supposed to administer the schools. That's probably not a good path for performance. And then finally, allow the non-University of Nevada boards to be appointed, because they could be appointed right now, today. If you go in the legislature, you change it in statute. And you could have the governor appoint the board from lists of vetted individuals who apply and say, I'd like to be on the board, and then the governor could determine their appropriateness. You could also put this in that committee for higher ed, and the vet list for higher ed and economic development. That could be another location for it. All right, step 3. We're calling it the University of Nevada Equity Act. So we're supposed to be equal. We're supposed to be equal branches of the land grant. That's true since '81. It's really true since '69, according to the regents. Yet the two branches are not equal in resources. The space, the services, everything is skewed to UNR. And here's an example. Just take a look at this building. We had a little cute academic success center in this bunker that's 1 story. So UNR said, we need one. This is theirs. This is what we have. We had it first. We had a little academic success center, and it's in a very nondescript building. It looks like, the old telephone company building or something like that, when we had an old telephone company. And then they built this super duper deluxe, sexy, mission revival, expensive thing up at UNR. And so the act would fix inequalities in resources. The universities would have roughly equal space per capita. The recruiting dollars, by the way, so UNR gets money to recruit our students from Clark County. They get to send them up by plane trips. They get money from the state for that. They get over $500,000. Either we get that money, or maybe you don't give that money altogether, and schools pay for it and suck it up out of their own budgets. And the reason I raise this is, I could make a case for UNLV getting the money, especially for graduate recruitment. We have a much larger and higher performing graduate school than UNR. Why do you think we're catching them? Okay, we have the only law school. We have the only architecture school. When I got here, this program I was in was ranked 153 out of 330. It's now ranked 87th, and it's accredited. There's nobody accredited up there in my field. There's whole disciplines that we do. They don't do. We're a much larger. Here's why. We got 2.5 million people, just about. We got 2.3 million people. You're in a region that size. You're bigger than Kansas City. You're going to have those assets, and you're going to have that kind of connectivity and placement. We would do well by taking their better students and recruiting them into our graduate school. It would be great. They're in the state. They're probably going to stay in Las Vegas. We could make a case for over $500,000 of recruitment, but we don't get it. And of course, funding per student about equitable. And the reason, of course, I put up, this is the 7th engineering building that they're going to get. U.S. News World Report, the engineering school here in UNR, they're not that different. They're pretty much the same kind of engineering school, but they've got 7 buildings. We've asked for a new engineering building. They're studying it. We've got to get donors. But for now, we have the robotics lab, the one that famously created that hand for the girl who had a malformation at birth, and now she's throwing out all the pitches in Major League Baseball. That is in the back of a 99-cent store. We don't even get the front. We don't even get the glory. We're in the back of a 99-cent store. You're in the largest region in the state. You've got all this opportunity for connectivity and a diversification of our regional economy. You've got a pretty good engineering school, considering how limited resources have been given over the years. And you're stiffing it. and you're building these deluxe buildings. I could go building by building. If anybody thinks this campus looks as large and as nice and as pampered as that UNR campus, then I'm going to take you on one of their campus tours and I'm going to charge them for flying you up there, because they do that. All right, and then finally, an equity act would also concern Co-op Extension, which we made a play for last time. Clark County has put the most resources into Co-op Extension, and yet $13 million of its resources, which have to be spent in the county, have gone underutilized because UNR simply failed to program it. And the reason they failed to program it is they're phoning it in from several hundred miles away. It's much easier if you're the University of California, for example, where everybody's in the land grant, and there's 2 designated ag schools, one at Davis and one at Riverside. They have different concerns north and south. We have different concerns north and south. We're approximately the same distance in the number of miles as they are. So if we could do that, we could do, for example, that next generation of research on marijuana. We could do locally grown hydroponic stuff. There's lots of things we can do. By the way, what Reno's not really taking its land grant mission so seriously. It's selling its college farm, cannibalizing it, and paying for its deluxe buildings, tearing down historic homes and things like that. So it's not like, my God, you're disrupting one of the great ag schools in the country. This is the airport. They're selling all these valuable parcels off. By the way, these parcels belong to all of us. They were given to this school by the federal government as part of a land grant so that you could do agriculture. When I went to Rutgers, they had an ag school. They invented the first 20 antibiotics out of the soil and cured tuberculosis out of that ag school. Not to mention those lovely tomatoes that came out of Jersey. And you think about Nebraska's ag school and all. Ag schools have proud, long traditions. You don't have to go selling the college farm. And if you're going to take it that not seriously, you know what? We could start a separate ag extension station down here. I think we do a pretty good job of it. And we make it very Vegas-like. And then finally, step 4, we need a couple of interim studies. And the first one should be, we've obviously run aground on this medical school stuff. I think Lindy might offer some thoughts during the panel that follows my talk. We probably need to go back to the legislature and kind of get a read and get some kind of interim committee together that would look into how to finance and how to build. And if we want to use new market tax credits, it has to be in some form of a public-private partnership or a nonprofit, or we want access to those resources and we do want to leverage that. The state doesn't want to build a $100 million or $200 million med school down in Las Vegas out of all of its resources. We need our donors, and we have our donors, and their donors are willing to do it. But if you get anybody on that board from NSHE or the Regents, forget about it. They're just not going to participate. They've told me that, and I think there's an intuitive sense by a lot of folks around the valley that that's just not going to work for us. And they can leave the legislature alone. The legislature has the right to define the infrastructure that's being invested in these various campuses, and it has the authority through its committees to organize around that. It's just invited NSHE, and the last time it invited NSHE into the formula study, the Regents got a separate briefing, and they were part of the corruption that led to that weird structure. And then finally, hey, you know what? We need a cost study, all right? And we need one that's legitimately based on what Nevada expends, and here's why. So that whole corrupt study that Dave talked about, that's what we're working under right now. So the guy got fired for this, and that's the stuff we're using to allocate resources. I mean, we could do better than that, I think. And then finally, what we can conclude, yep, we don't need to change the Constitution to get going, just pass H.R. 5 again anyway, though, because you might want to finish up in 2021 in that legislative session. Real reform, you could do blended boards, you could do appointed boards. Right now, you have to have an elected board for just the University of Nevada. The one system office, something that is below the regents, probably at parity with the presidents or below the level of the presidents. It's time to create the parity between 2 branches. And finally, we think, of course, this community colleges need not only their own governing boards. We think you need to take the community colleges and say, here's how much money the state thinks it can spend on community colleges. Now allocate to these various community colleges. And then here's how much the state thinks it can spend on the universities. Because if you don't do that and you create a performance structure, the universities are going to slaughter the community colleges. Want my proof? Go back to Dave's slides and look at the numbers. So we really have to make that change. And then the NOE office needs to fade in the background, get out of the way, and finally, and I'm handing it off to the panel like this, poor Board of Regents governance and NSHE leadership has put this medical school at risk, and that's a shame, because this medical school is going to provide a real lift to the health economy in this region. And it's always been the objective of this current governor to fix that part of this regional economy. Remember, we had a friend in this governor from the beginning on this medical school. He recognized that it was smart going back to the Brookings Economic Development Study, it was smart to do our own medicine. That it would allow it would allow Northern Nevada to go and pursue things like technology because it really needed to diversify its economy away from tourism. But when we revived our tourist economy, which we have successfully, and we are the world leaders in that economy, we also needed to fill out the rest of the functions of a large region at 2 million plus people. And that includes doing your own medicine. If you don't build this building, we're going to be like 60 students. We need 180 students. We need these people in our valley. So with that, I thank you. And I'll turn it over to the board.
Thank you, Rob. My name is Magdalena Martinez. I want to thank you all for being here today. I am going to be serving as moderator for the final panel. And while our panelists are getting mic'd up, I want to tell you that we're delighted that you're here to take part of this very important conversation. As illustrated in the presentations of Drs. Demore and Lang, public higher education is a critical and important asset for all states, but in particular the regions in which they reside. And we've heard a lot about different examples, the ways in which other states and other land-grant universities have contributed to the development of the region. And not just the economic development, but the social, political, and sustainability, really, of this experiment we call democracy. And as I mentioned, I'm Magdalena Martinez. I'm the Director of Education Programs here at the Lincy Institute. I've been here since 2013. And I also serve in another role where I'm tenured track assistant professor, not yet tenured, and that's why I'm the moderator and not presenting the quite controversial, some people might say, presentations. And I know firsthand the benefits of public higher education as a first-generation American and as a first-generation college student. Our panelists today are equally committed to expanding the pipeline and access, in particular, for our first-generation college students and, in particular, low-income. When you look at our region, we know that we are uniquely and powerfully different, and that is, we can talk about public higher education the benefits of it, but we have to remember who we're servicing also. So one of our panelists, who's being mic'd right now, is Miss Lindy Schumacher, who has been a philanthropist and fierce advocate in our region and creating access opportunities. Most notably, she has served on a number of boards here and worked with other philanthropists and other regional leaders in making sure that those investments are made for our institutions and to expand the public good for all. With us, we also have Mr. John Gwaltney, who has over 30 years of experience in community colleges, and most notably, he was a community college president here in Nevada and several other states. He also has dedicated to his life to expanding access vis-a-vis the community college institutions. Please join us. Oh, okay. All right. And I am going to jump into our questions. If available, we will open it up for Q&A. But I think it's important to hear from individuals who are on the front lines of creating many of these opportunities and also leading our institutions. So I'd like to start off by asking both of you to react to the presentations we heard, and specifically, Ms. Schumacher, your commitment to creating new pathways for underserved populations has led you to make significant investments in public higher education. I'm thinking most notably the medical school. In what ways, if at all, has the current state-level administration and governing structure limited or facilitated your ability to develop sustainable relationships with key higher education leaders?
Well, I wear two hats. I am the CEO of the Fulfillment Fund Las Vegas. We send the vast majority of our students to Southern Nevada universities. And I also wear another hat where I get to represent a philanthropist. So when I watch an NSHE meeting, I actually was asked this yesterday at lunch, why do you go to these meetings? And I said, because I believed, and I really felt I had enough information to know that what was happening was all coming down in those meetings, and it was diabolical in nature, and yet I hadn't sat through enough of them. I went to hit or miss meetings. Now I go to all of them, and if you watch it on TV, you'll see my face sometimes. I'm like, oh my God, like, gotta be kidding me. I'm animated because I just can't believe what happens in that building. And a perfect example, we had presentations on the med school, and I could hear people in the audience say, well, that's a complete lie. That's a lie. And I'm like, yeah, that is a lie, isn't it? And yet no one asks any questions, and there's no accountability, and no one calls anyone out. And you just have these moments of, it isn't my imagination. What is happening in these meetings is diabolical. They sold the farm. Did anyone at UNR want to sell the farm? Absolutely not. The students, the community. I went up to Truckee and watched this meeting. The line of 200 students out the door, business owners, professors. We are here because of the farm. They had no reason to sell the farm. They couldn't give you one, hadn't gone out to bid, they didn't assess the value, and they sold the farm, guys. I just sit there and go, it isn't my imagination. Mm-hmm. So to represent first generation students at a university that is supposed to be so diverse, and yet we don't operate with any integrity when it comes to serving that generation and that population of students. We are really good on paper. They come, our students are there, they're diverse, they're outstanding, and we don't serve them. You can see that in almost every capacity of the university, as well as the UNLV Foundation. I see it in every place I put my time and talents. I walk away very, very sad that we say who we are, but we do not act how we are. And it's been a struggle for me personally and professionally, because the only way our community is going to be better is based on the strength of UNLV, not on UNR, not on our community colleges. It's based on the strength of UNLV. That is how not only is Southern Nevada going to bob to the top, the state of Nevada, who pays the bills of Nevada, will bob to the top.
Now, along the same lines, Dr. Gwaltney, in your professional experience, what are the major, or what were and what are the major limitations of centralized governing structures, in particular as community colleges work to meet their goals and priorities at the local levels?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it. But I do want you to know I got up at 4 o'clock this morning to get on an airplane. So. But as Rob finished his discussion, I'd like to comment on that for a second, okay, because the response to that, I understand that UNLV has had a real challenge dealing with UNR. By the way, I presided over an institution 4 miles away from UNR for a period of 10 years. People ask me, did you have a full head of hair when you arrived? And the answer was no, but it was pretty close. And it was brown at the time. Coping with UNR has been a real challenge for the community colleges in the north. Mm-hmm. And you saw an example of a formula. And I'd like for a moment to tell you that I hesitate to use the term formula, because the word formula tends to depict the idea of some fair distribution of resources, and this is anything but. This particular model, which is used to disseminate resources in this state, came off the back of a lie. Let me repeat that. It came off the back of a lie. And there was no unit cost study that produced that. And frankly, I invested the better part of 3 weeks of time. I may sound a little like Mark Twain in the sense that Mark Twain once said he was a journalist because he couldn't find honest work. I was a community college president, and sometimes I think it's because I couldn't find honest work. But because of 20 years of being a community college president, I knew a number of people across the state. Born and raised in Illinois, and my first presidency was there. Illinois was one of those 4 states that they claimed was data related to that formula. I didn't know any of the people I called in Illinois, but we knew people in common, if that makes sense. So in a sense, I kind of had an inroad. I couldn't find one person in the higher ed organization in Illinois that would justify the idea that junior level classes ought to be worth twice as much in response to a freshman-sophomore class. So the driving forces within the model have been extremely negative to the community colleges. Rob raised the issue of, was there fair distribution of those resources for the community colleges to carry out their mission? And the answer is no. Now, since the adoption of the formula, I provided a second sheet that was not in Dave's presentation, but the second sheet indicates that the percentage of the state's resources going to community colleges has continued to decline ever since the adoption of that model. So what has happened here? Let me kind of close my opening thoughts on this subject carefully by telling you shortly after I got here, I had been president of a community college in Illinois. We had a basketball team. We had a debate team. We sent kids. I sent 2 basketball players to play on a national champion, and I'm talking about 4-year Final Four team, and we were very competitive. And our kids showed up and screamed and yelled and were in support of. People say, well, community college people won't do that. Yeah, they will. It builds institutional pride and so on. Don't have it here. But the big thing that offended me was the transfer problem that exists in this state. Community college students have a hard time transferring to universities, and that should not happen. We're all in the same system. If you have time, log on to the system webpage and look up the 2015 Articulation and Transfer Audit. That audit suggests 19% of the students who were polled had a hard time or a very difficult time moving to the universities. That didn't offend me. Should have, but it didn't. What offended me is the system office didn't bother to look at those students that fell between the cracks. Oh, I'm talking about the students who never made the transition. As we talk about documents to justify economic development, I used to tell Dan Clates, the next time you stand up and say, give us more money so we can graduate more graduates, I'm going to sit down behind you and say, treat the community college transfers better, and you'll graduate more students. Thank you for the opportunity to let off a little stream.
Yes, and I know that in previous interactions, and in fact you've been a pretty public advocate on a separate governing structure for community colleges for some of the reasons you've just highlighted, because having a dedicated line for community colleges versus in one lump sum, then money matters, quite frankly. Money matters for community colleges, and the funding formula as illustrated by Dr. DeMoore has really disadvantaged all institutions except one in the state. So we also heard about the various missteps, to put it lightly, of the current statewide higher education office with regards to withholding reports from regents and legislators and hiring their own consultants to legitimize their policy proposals and circumvent the legislative deliberative process. Lindy, as an engaged local philanthropist, how might these actions and behaviors by the state office affect other philanthropists' interest and their ability to trust that their investments will be used for the public good?
So in one of those wonderful meetings that I sat through, I believe it was Regent Stevens or Stevenson, she said, why don't we just take the anonymous donors, $25 million from the med school, and put it in engineering? And I was like, I mean, couldn't possibly be that dumb, right? I mean, there's no way you don't understand the basics. But here's the catch. They probably could do that, and here's why. The foundations of your universities ask your donors for money. They write grants, they get the money for a particular cause, and all of that goes into the hands of your elected regents who don't have any idea what they're doing. And they believe that this money is theirs to be spent as they see fit. And then you turn to the foundations and you think, well, you're going to go fight for the donor, right? I mean, they're your donor. You looked them in the eye, you asked them for money, you put your name and reputation behind this, and you know what you get? Crickets. Not an ounce of support of a donor, or the mission, or the request, or the intention. You hear nothing. Why is that? They're scared to death. If they stood up and said, Chris Singlestat was right, she can take her money back. Oh, hell would have broken loose on UNLV's foundation. They couldn't even get their in-house legal to say that she didn't do anything wrong. That was a 45-minute tap dance I had to sit through, watching him pretend like it's just we can't say anything. What do you mean you can't say anything? Yes or no, did Chris Ingolstadt do something wrong? Tap dance. Tap dance. I was like, no, okay, so she didn't. So you're a donor and you're giving the university money. You're giving it to the foundation. The foundation then refers all control over to the regents. So as a donor, are you going to move forward? No, we're not, because now we have uncovered how twisted and tangled that really is. There is no trust in the regents. There is no trust in the chancellor. There is no trust in the way that they handle our leaders and the talent that brought the donors to the table in the first place. If you're going to fire the talent, then we're out. It's as simple as that. And unless, of course, you can tell me something really bad happened, then we're going to go, okay. But like, let's use USC for an example. USC last week, I think it was they fired a guy, I can't even remember, maybe it was business school. Yeah, business school. And the donors stood up for him. And they are fighting a serious fight right now with the foundation and the trustees and the university and their interim president. They are fighting for their talent. Now, whether or not he deserves the fight isn't my call. I'm in Las Vegas. But Len Jessup deserved the fight. And there were crickets from our foundation, from our community. It took a while. The community rallied. But we have no nerve. You really do not have the nerve to go back to a donor and say, it's all good, right? I mean, you're happy now? Like, things are okay? You happy with Marta? Everybody good? That's very, very nervy. No, it's not good. The system's still in place. The chancellor's still in place. They're still capable of doing whatever they choose to do. And never once did a foundation stand up and support Chris Ingolstadt and the Ingolstadt Family Foundation. So don't bother asking.
So it sounds like the current structure really is not built to sustain those types of relationships or even develop those types of relationships. As Dave DeMore illustrated, the current pre-2005 structure and now the current structure. It really devolves a lot of that power to a chancellor, a non-elected bureaucrat. So changing that would likely change the relationship. Now, along the same lines, how important, John, is the reputation of a statewide education office in shaping the public perceptions of community colleges and their ability to build community trust?
I think it's on a scale of 1 to 10, 0. You know, for the most part, the people I see in Reno and I talk to in the Sparks area and so on have very little knowledge about the chancellor in the central office and so on.
He's busy micromanaging UNLV.
Yeah. Well, let me indicate to you, from the community college standpoint, the problem with the system office at this time in relation to facilities in particular is community colleges have a lot more trouble finding somebody who's willing to give them $5 million, so on. I can recall getting a donation when I was serving of $250,000, which in reference to what you're talking about is peanuts, but it was the first $250,000 donation that our foundation had ever received. And I went to a Regents meeting kind of thinking I might get an attaboy for announcing $250,000. I didn't even get to say it. I mean, I didn't get that far down the list. Within that same year, we received a $2.5 million Department of Education grant, which was the largest grant that any community college received that year west of the Mississippi River. I tried to announce that at a Regents meeting the same month that UNLV won the national champions in basketball. And so I'm not suggesting that it's bad here. I'm a great fan. By the way, I hate to admit it, but I'll root for UNR when the two play. So I live there and my neighbors do it, so on. But I'm there, I'm season ticket holder and all that kind of thing. But the capital distributing of funds in this state is very hard for the community colleges. The space allocation question, because it's often premised on something you do very well, and I'm not knocking that, you have raised an awful lot of money in support of facilities here in Las Vegas. UNR has done a pretty good job of that. But to get enough to attract an attention for CSN or for TMCC is very difficult. And so often we find ourselves slipping down the list because we can't put the bait on the table that draws legislative support.
Right. And I'd like to conclude with one last question, and thank you for your thoughts. And I think that that is important to highlight the ways in which community colleges within a highly centralized structure are really at a disadvantage. Now, Rob presented a series of recommendations, 3. The first one was to repass, restructure, and I'm going to forget the other let's see here, it was
Revote?
Revote, that's right. And in particular, the repass AJR 5, which takes the governing University of Nevada Regents out of the Constitution and revote the land grant status and restructure the legislative committees to include higher education committees. And then he talked about also 2 bills, the one system bill that restructures the function, budget, and the titles of the statewide higher education office that services the colleges and universities. And in that bill, he also talked about repositioning the regents to their elected post of hiring and firing presidents in particular. And this bill would also create a separate appointed governing board for community colleges. Rob also talked about the University of Nevada Equity Bill, which focuses on bringing parity to the universities in terms of funding and investments and creating separate budget lines for community colleges exclusively. And by the way, folks, we've been working on and thinking about these issues since 2013. This is kind of a culmination, really, of many years of research and thought and conversations with many stakeholders. Of those 3 approaches, is there any one that really stands out more to you, and if so, why?
I could pick. I mean, I would love to think there's a loser on the list, but I really think that some of these things can alleviate the stress of being a president or hiring a talented president, and then you can actually maybe find some talent outside of Nevada that would be interested in coming here. Those kind of constitutional changes have to happen. I can't even imagine why someone would apply for this job. So, or the job of any university president or one of our 2 years. You're half crazy because they have the ability to destroy. They proved it. People were paying attention. It's not locals. I had someone out of Florida ask me, am I crazy for considering working in the Clark County School District after what they did to Len Jessup? And I thought, well, those aren't 2 related items, but they consider them very related. You're not going to find talent in education at all until all of these things change. I couldn't pick a loser on the list. They are all necessary for change.
All right, thank you.
I agree. Maybe 2 quick short stories would help demonstrate that from a community college position. Shortly after I arrived here, speaking of articulation and transfer, I was in a Council to Presidents meeting in the Chancellor's office, door closed. We were talking about how to get ready for the legislative session. The Chancellor at the time said, we know we have a transfer and articulation problem, and we'll tell the legislature that we're working on it and we're going to fix it. By the way, that was 26 years ago. And it's been fixed 3 times since then, and the glue keeps coming off. But that's a side effect. I said, no, we won't, because I don't lie to legislators. I've never done it, and I'm not going to do it now. And later I got a phone call from the chair of the Board of Regents explaining that I had a choice. I could either sit quietly and not say anything, or I could quit.
Code for get fired?
No.
Same message I think Len Jessup got.
Yeah, that phone call and how that works becomes extremely heavy psychologically, because when you're hired as the president of an institution, I don't care if it's Great Basin or it's Stanford, your job is to defend that faculty and those students. Mm-hmm. That's the first priority you have. And when somebody tells you that you can't do that, you're not allowed to do that, you become diminished in a way that becomes extremely hard to sleep at night. Now, I don't know quite how those options fix that, but let me explain to you the second quick story. I talked to the just recent past president of TMCC the other day, and there was a battle going on, which I rarely ever get involved on campus with battles anymore. But UNR decided it needed to control TMCC's police department. The department, the students didn't want it, the faculty didn't want it, the president didn't want it. They all testified against it. I went in and testified at a Regents meeting against it, and the Regents voted for it.
Of course they did.
Now, the claim of the central office was this saves $450,000, which you're going to put in the classroom.
Not your classroom.
Well,
no. At UNR's classroom.
Well, I'm not sure where, to be honest. The fact is that it really didn't exist. If there's anything I did well as a college president, I was really good with numbers. I wasn't the best human relations person in the world and so on, but I was good with numbers. And I looked at this operation, and there might have been $45,000 to $60,000 worth of savings. But playing musical chairs doesn't, it's a form of lying, but it's a form of kind of technically okay lying. What was happening is when they disbanded the police department, they shoved people into other budgets. The cost of the institution is exactly the same. It's just in a different line item. And so the president didn't want it, the students didn't want it, the faculty didn't want it, but they approved it. Now, that's when I talk about feeling diminished. I was president of 2 other institutions, and frankly, they weren't as large. It is large. Probably in the pecking order of community colleges in the nation, probably not as significant as TMCC. But being president of that institution, I was much prouder being a rep, to tell you the truth.
Now, Bill, do we have quite time for 1 or 2 burning questions?
I think we can. If people don't mind staying a little late, we want to be respectful of your time. If you need to leave, please don't feel like you can't. But if there's 1 or 2 questions, or you can come up and speak to our colleagues afterwards.
I think we have one over here.
One over here. That's okay. We just want to get it on the recording. So if you speak up.
Yeah. I attended a meeting sponsored by the Las Vegas Metro Chamber of Commerce, and they had 5 committees dealing with different topics to propose to the next legislature. And one of them was the committee dealing with education. And we heard some of the key individuals from this esteemed higher education group. And the leader of it said that you need a degree to be successful. And that is what I want to change in the world, in the state. You can list all of our tops, a lot of our top successful people, and they don't have a college degree. They might have went to it. And I think we were talking about integrity. I think it's the biggest lie to tell people they have to have a college degree. Now, I've got 2 of them, and I can see benefits to it. You can't get a commission in the military without a degree and things of that sort. But when you have 250 TED Talks, all under 18 minutes, and if you listen to all of them, you would be smarter than if you went to a 4-year college. You would miss out on the parties and the football events. But I think we're doing a great lie to say that you have to have a college degree. So therefore, we should have ways of knowing what YouTube and TED Talks and MIT Talks and Stanford Talks people need to do, and then still encourage them to network.
I'm going to take that one if you don't mind, since I run a college access program. A few of my most talented employees are here in the room. And when you run a college access program, it sounds like by definition, by the way, I have a board member in the room, sounds like by definition the success is a 4-year diploma. At the Fulfillment Fund, we define success as what our student and their families define success as. So whether that is trade school, 2-year, 4-year, combination of all of the above, we want our students to develop into the human that is going to make them the most happy, satisfied member of this community. You go community to community and you're going to get a different answer. I have the benefit of serving, what are we up to? 1,600 students, 17 employees. Most of them are first-generation employees and first-generation students. And we define success the way they define it. Not a white, wealthy definition of a four-year diploma, because that's what other communities do. That's not what we're doing here. This community is very nimble. We're very smart. Our donors get it. I sit down with donors and they'll say, is a success measured by a four-year diploma? I go, not mine. It's a definition of the student and their family. Their families, these are parents who are working very, very hard, and they're paying their bills, and the kids are fed and they're clothed, and they're hoping for the best that they could possibly give their son or their daughter. But that's their definition, not mine. So we find that evolution of who you are at age 18, 19, 20, 21, 22 is changing, and it's changing very positively in this town. I can't judge the rest of the country, but I can say in Southern Nevada, we're seeing an evolution not just of our students and our community, but of our donor base. Success is not defined by a college diploma. We are allowing our students to define their own success, and we're giving them the power to choose. If I had one choice at all, I would say at the end of your 4 years at Chaparral, you have an acceptance letter to a university. Whether you choose to take it is yours. Why? Because at age 18, you might want to do that. At age 22, you might change your mind somewhere along the way. We're there to serve you as you change the way you want to be as a human being. So I think, believe it or not, I can actually applaud Nevada for doing something a little more innovative, and we don't have people stopping us from defining like happiness and success, because our town's nimble, it's young. Everything isn't about a four-year diploma. I used to sit on the UNLV's foundation board, and for the most diverse university in the country, do I think we serve those students super well? No, I don't. I think it takes an eternity to get out of there. Do I think that we were on the path of solving that? Yes, under Len Jessup, I do believe we were on the path of solving that, allowing our students to make some of those critical decisions on their own. Do I think we're on the path to solving that any longer? No, I think we're doing nothing again. So, the pro and the con is, I think we're evolving. I think we're smarter than that definition of a four-year diploma. But I also think it all lands on the heels of who is leading the charge and who is running your universities.
And to connect it back to governance, and this is, I think, underscores the need for community colleges to have their own governing structure.
Yes.
Because community colleges intimately understand that the workforce, at least 60% of the workforce, will need some sort of meaningful post-secondary training, maybe not a degree, but some sort of certificate or training. And this is where community colleges are critically important. And so having separate governing structures and individuals appointed, they would understand that. Bill?
I don't want to cut anyone off, but
Wrap it up.
I think it's already getting to the quarter hour, and you've been very patient. So thank you all very much for coming and for being a part of this. Our speakers will be around if you want to have any post-session discussion or questions. And we look forward to seeing you at our next event.
Thank you.
Thank you, John. Really appreciate you.
I had a great time.
Thank you. Always wonderful.